I came back from the airport with a ticket stub in my pocket and my husband's last name still warm on my tongue, and I heard my son say, clear as a bell, that there was no need for me to inherit anything. The words struck me like a thrown cup. For a moment, I could not remember the flavor of the tea in my mouth, or whether the sky had been a polite blue or the solemn gray of farewells. I stood at the threshold of the house I had helped knit with years of knitted dishcloths and Sunday suppers, and my own son spoke of erasing me as if I were a stray mark in a ledger he'd already corrected. Was this the same boy who once kissed my hair with flour on his cheek? Was this the same voice that used to ask me to tie his shoelaces? I knocked and the door opened half an inch. Laughter leaked through, soft and condescending, like steam from a kettle that had forgotten how to whistle. Then they spoke my name as if it were an inconvenience. I will not pretend the first line of this story is small. It is a sword. Had anyone told me, when I was younger and thought the world a long-suffering book, that the last chapters would be read to me like this, I would have laughed. Instead, I swallowed my laugh and listened. When my Henry left, God rest his patient heart, he left more than a chair at the head of the table. He left, as men of habit sometimes messily leave, papers he thought he had time to tidy, a will that should have meant my peace, a durable power of attorney he had signed with a weary hand on March 20th, and a bank ledger that still carried the smell of his pipe. I had been at the airport to fetch a small trunk he had mailed ahead, to carry home the last of the books he loved, books that smelled like tobacco and the sea. I had been guileless enough to imagine these small things would be returned to their orbit, that I would find my place again between the chipped mug and the mason jar where I kept my coins. But houses keep their own counsels, and family keeps its own knives. I am an old woman who has been loved and who has loved, two different crafts. I have hands that remember how to mend socks and how to hold a child on a stormy night. I have a mason jar on my kitchen shelf labeled for Christmas that has survived 3 moves, 2 boar storms, and a lost cat. That jar is full not of luxuries, but of small remembrances, a quarter folded like a note, a paper-clipped receipt from 1999 for a violin lesson I paid for because someone insisted he would become a musician. The jar is my ledger of sacrifice, the weight of it a private currency. Henry and I had a life that did not glitter but was rich enough. Warm porridge, a radio that played the news at 6, a chipped mug with a blue star he bought me the first Christmas we were poor and in love. In the back of my wardrobe, I keep a strand of pearls he saved for from second jobs and overtime, pearls that have the dull, honest sheen of things earned slowly. The pearls lived in an old velvet box that smelled faintly of mothballs and lavender, and I would take them out on Sundays and run them between my fingers like rosary beads, feeling the rhythm of a life steady and true. My daughter, yes, I have a daughter, lived in a house that seemed built of light. She has never learned to cook in a way that comforts the bones. Instead, she comforts herself and others with what money can buy: flights, art, a valet who irons shirts with a devotion bordering on religion. She called often enough to say that she was too busy to come by, but when I visited her home, I felt like a guest in a museum, admired, attended, and politely excluded. She loved me in the way people love a painting, admiring from a distance. She sent me orchids for my birthday and thought it enough. My son Robert, however, my boy with the flower in his hair, is the one who moved into Henry's study after the funeral. He took to the leather armchair like it had been needed for him. He has a wife, Vivian, who wears silk as if it were armor and laughs at things that are not funny yet to me. When Robert married Vivian, he came to me with the shy look of a man who had stolen a pastry and hoped I would forgive him. I stitched a cardigan for their wedding and did not imagine that the stitches would one day strangle me. I could have been blind. I confess I saw only the bright surface. I gave and gave as mothers do, and the ledger of my life filled with invisible ink, small acts of love that later would seem to have no witnesses. I had become used to being the housekeeper of memory, the slow vessel that held a family's beginning, and I mistook that for power. On the morning I returned from the airport, the house smelled wrong, like something that's been stored in cedar for too long and remembers only its own silence. The maid, a A young woman Henry had hired in the end because he did not want me to lift heavy boxes anymore, opened the door and looked at me as if I had been a package delivered incorrectly. Her eyes flicked to the luggage on my shoulder, not to the trembling in my hands. "Mrs. Ellery, Robert is in the study." She said it without the little curtsy of secrets. It was a line read from an index card. I walked down the hallway where family portraits hang like judges of our better days, and I felt them all glance away. The grand piano at the end of the hall had Henry's cigarette ash on the brass. No one had thought to wipe it away. I knocked on the study door and heard voices. Not the low, affectionate tones of two adults discussing sorrow, but a measured, almost businesslike cadence that set my teeth on edge. Vivian was speaking that brittle, bright voice. "It's simpler if the durable power is signed over. 2 weeks. We'll handle the accounts, $230,000 in the checking we can reassign. Mother will never notice." It was there, precise, a number spoken like a recipe. My skin went cold where my hand rested on the doorknob. I heard Robert's laugh. It was too young for his face. "We can execute it on April 3rd, 2 days before the gala," he said. "We'll tell everyone it was Henry's wish." April 3rd, 2 days before the gala. The name of a day lodged like a splinter. My heart is an ordinary, earnest thing. It had leaned on these children and trusted that they would return that weight. But their voices were architects of a new plan, one that did not include me. I remember the taste of iron in my mouth, as if I had bitten through a nail. I drifted to the door as if moved by some animal memory. The curtains were half drawn. They had been careless, which is the kind of careless that reveals more than any confession. The study smelled of polish and lemon and the faint perfume of Vivian's skin. Vivian's laugh came like glass. "Mother is set in her ways," she said. "She keeps that mason jar, the beads, the chipped mug. If she asks, we love her, we visit. If she insists, well, we have options." "Options?" Robert's voice trembled with something I could not name. "Like, what do you mean?" Vivian said nothing for a moment, and then in the coldest voice I have ever heard from a woman who labels her salad dressing. "We'll move her to assisted living. We'll have the durable power. We'll restrict access. The house is worth more without her meddling." The room tilted. I felt as if I had been set on a table and someone shook it. I pressed my palm against the wood and listened harder, for reasons I cannot now explain, except that the old habit of listening, of hearing the world, has been my safety. I could have turned and walked away. I could have let the stroke of time disguise their ambition with its usual kindly excuses. Instead, something in me that Henry used to call stubbornness leaned forward. I knew the words, durable power of attorney. Henry had signed one. Yes, but he had been the sort of man who signed many things without a clear thought, leaving instructions scribbled on the back of envelopes. Yet a durable power is no trifling. It gives authority to act when one cannot. It is the hinge on which private worlds swing shut or open. They spoke of it as if it were a hinge to be turned without a key. I never expected to be treated like a stranger. I placed my ear against the crack of the door. Robert said, "We'll have the lawyer, Mr. Collins, draft it. He owes me a favor from when I got him into the football club." Vivian clapped her hands softly. "Mr. Collins will be discreet. We can have the bank sign off on a transfer of the $230,000 from the checking to a trust. It's legal. $230,000. The number skittered across my mind like a beetle on a hot pan. It was not the total of Henry's worth, not by a long margin, but it was enough to be a motive. Money is like a weather vane. It tells you which way the wind blows in a family. I had always thought our family was a dense old oak, rooted and immovable, but it seemed we were a sapling, easily bent by those who pressed. There were more papers on the desk than there had been 2 weeks ago. A sealed envelope lay on the blotter, a pen, uncapped, like a snake that had been startled. I remembered the return flight, my empty seat on a plane that smelled of coffee and the ghosts of conversations. I had thought I was returning home to find Henry's will tucked safely in his desk. I had imagined him, in his neat hand, making a last wry comment about who would get the port wine. I had imagined, with the kind of foolishness that grows from long marriages, that the world would right itself in small familiar rituals. Instead, my son and his wife planned to rewrite the map of my life. I could have spoken, burst in like a kettle scalded with honesty, and yet I did not. I had been raised to be tactful, and tact sometimes must be pretended to hide a blade. I stepped back, the wood creaking under my weight, and walked down the hall where the family photographs looked like accused conspirators. Their smiles were all the same, the pretzel of memory twisted into pleasant shapes. Outside the window, the laburnum tree shed a rain of yellow petals like small confessions. When I reached the kitchen, the mason jar winked at me from its shelf, a modest glow in the dim. I put the trunk I had brought down on the sideboard and opened it slowly. Inside were Henry's books, an old ledger, and an envelope marked in his looped hand. For Eleanor, the will, April 1st. The label made my hands sweat. April 1st, a day that sounded like a subtle joke in a cruel play. I had the will in my trunk, and yet my son had the nerve to speak as if no will existed. I sat at the table and took out the envelope. My fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from something which can only be called the precise tightness of a heart recognizing a trap. Inside, the will was folded twice. Henry's handwriting was slanted and courteous, as if even his final testament wanted to be polite. He named me as his sole heir to the house and half of the accounts. He left a small bequest to my daughter, a sum to a charity I had always supported, and he asked, in a sentence that made me drop the letter as if burned, that the pearls go to me. He had written the date, April 1st, the day before the gala that the family throws in his memory. He had written the witness's name in a shaky hand. I pinched the bridge of my nose and the world swam in black and gold. Henry had done this. He had signed his paper that declared his intention. Yet Robert planned to make it disappear with the commonplace cunning of those who believe law is a game of tricks. They were planning to take my life in the way thieves take a clock, by removing the hands. I called the lawyer, Mr. Collins, because one does not trust conversations overheard through oak and curtain. The telephone rang, then was answered with an easy professional tone that suggested Mr. Collins thinks the world is assembled from contracts and not from hearts. "Ah, Mrs. Ellery," he said. "How may I assist?" I mentioned Henry's will. He cleared his throat in an exacting manner and said, "We will need the original to probate it. If you have it, bring it in. Was it executed in the presence of witnesses?" "Yes," I whispered. "It was." "Then there should be no problem," he said. Unless there are disputes." His emphasis lacquered the word. "Disputes can take time. A contested will, allegations of undue influence, claims that the durable power was misused." My throat closed like a door. Undue influence, misused power. The phrases feel like frost on the window of one's certainty. I laid the will on the kitchen table and stared at the pearls box, which glinted under the lamp. The pearls felt heavier than they had a week earlier, as if the knowledge of being desired had given them gravity. I thought of Henry, of his laugh, of the way he would warm my hands when a storm froze our limbs. I thought of the dinner parties he had insisted we host, where he would sit and watch me with a sort of astonished pride, as if I were the only woman he ever knew to steam a pudding correctly. A small idea, dangerous only because it was honest, crept into my head. Perhaps I could call the bank. Perhaps I could put a stop to transfers. Perhaps I could record conversations. Perhaps there were witnesses to their plotting. Set the will back in the envelope and placed it inside the locked jewelry box where Henry used to keep things he called important but not urgent. I hid the key beneath the mason jar, a place no thief would look if the thief has forgotten how to treasure small domestic habits. I made tea in the chipped mug until my hands steadied. The kettle sang me a small, sullen song. At noon, I found a note on the fridge in Vivian's precise handwriting. "Housekeeping arranged. We'll handle the lawyers. Please relax." A farther note had the breezy air of a hand that thinks kindness can be manufactured. My fingers closed around it like a trap. I walked to the window and watched the road. People passed like beads on a string. The postman with his cadence, a boy on a bicycle who waved, a woman with a dog on a leash. Life moved with its small cruelties and beauties, indifferent to the plotting within my own walls. I have always believed that truth, like bread, must be kneaded and then left to rise. It cannot be rushed. It only blooms when given time and heat. Yet there are moments when the oven must be opened and the loaf snatched from the flames. I felt that hunger like a physical ache. Something inside me hardened, not into stone, but into the tempered steel of someone who has been left and will not leave herself unmade. I had the will. My son and his wife conspired to replace my future with a ledger scratch. The mason jar sat on its shelf like a small, quiet witness. I do not yet know how to fight them. I do not yet know which alliances I will forge or betray. But I know this: promises made in the shade will not stand in the sun. The photograph of Henry on the mantel seemed to tilt and look at me with the patience of a man who had always known the cost of honor. There was a sound behind me like the closing of a hand. They were coming into the kitchen. They smiled at me as if I were a comfortable, old chair to be kept in the corner and dusted on. Festival days, and yet between those smiles a plan was being stitched as neatly as a burial shroud. I learned in the weeks that followed that betrayal is not a thunderclap, but a sequence of small, cold instruments. The polite lawyer who forgets to look you in the eye, the bank teller who arranges a consultation at the very hour the durable power was to be signed, the aunt who suddenly remembers a verbal wish. Each instrument alone would not have felled me. Together they made a chorus whose music I would have to drown out with my own voice. I did not go to war like a woman who is furious and foolish. I went to war like a woman who has had time to learn the pattern of a rug, where the threads run thin, where a hand might pull one with impunity, and where a small knot will reveal an entire design. The first thing I did was the least theatrical. I counted. I called the bank, the Westshire Trust, on April 6th at 9:12 a.m., and I asked for a simple statement. The clerk, a polite young man named Daniel who smelled faintly of aftershave and ink, read lines and numbers to me as if reciting scripture. Savings, checking, a joint annuity, a CD earmarked in Henry's name. When I asked about transfers, he hesitated and said they had no pending transfers, but added, in a voice that tried to be helpful, that Mr. Ellery's durable power of attorney was on file the previous day. On file? I repeated. With what date? April 3rd, ma'am. We have a scanned copy. April 3rd, the very day they had spoken about in the study, 2 days after the will Henry had written on April 1st. My teeth found each other like two shutters closing. I went to the bank in person. The Westshire Trust had marble floors that made echoes. They wore their glories like the frivolous pride of those who have never known a bare pantry. Daniel met me at the teller line as if he expected only a quiet complaint. He led me to a small office where the blinds could be closed and steam from the street would not interrupt a gentle deception. Mrs. Ellery, he said with that practiced blandness that sounds like varnish, there's a PDF on file that gave Mr. Robert Ellery certain rights. It's been signed and witnessed by Mr. Collins, your attorney. It's clean. Can I see it? I asked. He pushed a printed page across the desk. The heading read, Durable Power of Attorney, Limited. It bore my husband's name, and below, in a hand that feigned the tremor of old age, was the signature that looked like Henry H. Ellery. It had a notary stamp dated April 3rd, and Mr. Collins' neat scrawl as witness. I felt something in me that had hitherto been patient and slow to anger snap like a twig. I left the bank with a copy in my hand and a new map of the enemy laid out before me. The photocopy warmed in my pocket like captured prey. I walked until my knees remembered the way they used to lock around a child on my lap. I sat on a bench near the laburnum tree and opened the file. There was a clause about financial stewardship and language that spoke of medical decisions. It was legalese, slippery as oil. I had the original will in my locked box, dated April 1st. This document, signed April 3rd, gave Robert and Vivian the right to make decisions. If they could produce an instrument giving them power, they could begin to rearrange the furniture of my life. I had come to understand that greed is clever. Greed thinks itself the architect of destiny. Greed will arrange even small men in gilded positions if they will ink a line for a fee. Mr. Collins, who had once been a friendly presence at our table, would now study the ledger of Henry's life and see only numbers, not stories. But I needed more than a photocopy and a bank clerk's mild unease. I needed undeniable proof of wrongdoing, an admission, an email, a recorded exchange, something that would stand in court as solid as the oak in Henry's study. So I asked for allies in places a greedy family would not expect an old woman to look. I returned to the maid, Rosa, the one they had employed for her neatness and to spare my back from heavy boxes. Rosa had a face that told stories of afternoons in kitchens and hands that smelled of lemon. When I found her in the pantry restocking, she was surprised to see me, not with disdain, but with the kind of startled respect that one gives a woman who has returned from a long pilgrimage. "Rosa," I said, "have you ever seen Mr. Collins at our house?" She blinked and the kitchen tiles made a tiny symphony. "Sometimes, Senora. He comes with papers. He likes the tea. Did he ever bring a man named Robert to sign anything?" Rosa's hand paused on a jar of sugar. "Once. He looked very nervous." They spoke in whispers. I thought it sad. Her reticence was not loyalty to Robert, but a fear of losing her job. Poor people are often the silent scaffolding on which families raise their fortunes. I promised her discretion, and I promised her a small raise if she would help me. She agreed, because the rises of wages are like lamps to those who live in penumbra. Rosa knew the schedule of the household. She told me that on April 2nd, the day before the bank recorded the durable power, Mr. Collins had come late and left a manila envelope in the study. The envelope had a black wax seal, and she had tucked it beneath the blotter when no one looked. She had not had the courage to touch it beyond that. That envelope, she said, had been retrieved by Vivian's hands 2 days later. "It will be in the desk," I said, and Rosa's eyes widened with a loyalty to the truth I had not expected. We were two small, low-placed things making a coalition. I went home and waited until the house was asleep and the lights were few. I retrieved the key I had hidden beneath the mason jar and went back to the desk. The desk had 3 drawers. The top drawer contained Henry's tin of matches and the red seal stamps for invoices. The second had an old letter from the war, stiff and creased. And the third, the bottom, was where a man with a guilty soul will sometimes shove his conscience when no one is looking. I opened it. There was dust, a forgotten cufflink, and a folded piece of paper that smelled faintly of lemon. I unfolded it and found a copy of a proposed amendment to will with a draft signature. The paper bore Vivian's neat typewritten notes in the margin, "Ensure durable power on April 3rd. The draft was not the original will, but a corruption. A mock will that gave parties a sliver of the estate in case of beneficial rearrangement. And beneath it, folded small like a secret, was a photocopy of an email chain. The email chain was a ribbon that, when followed, led to the Oak of Truth. It was between Mr. Collins and a redacted email, Robert Ellery. The subject line read, "Finalize documents." The dates, March 28th through April 2nd, showed negotiations and financial figures. There was a line, "Fee for expedited handling, $5,000, discretion assured." Another line, the most damning, said, "You understand that with the durable power in place, we can smooth the transfers ahead of probate?" I read it twice and my hands trembled. This was the paper that would unmask them. An email admitting quid pro quo, Mr. Collins's arrangement for a fee. If a court saw this, it would see motive and collusion. But an email alone can be dismissed by a shrewd liar as taken out of context. I needed a live admission. Mr. Collins's voice, not merely his typed words. The house has corners where secrets gather like dust. One corner is under the stair, behind a stack of moving boxes. Another is the shed where Henry kept his radio. There is also, peculiar to my son Robert, a study voice recorder he once used for interviews and which he left charging in the library. On April 9th at 11:03 p.m., when the house had breathed itself to sleep, I slipped into the library and found the small recorder humming faintly, a green light like an honest eye. I put it in my pocket like a charm, and next morning, while Mr. Collins came to deliver the final paperwork he presented as routine, I greeted him with tea and an old, milky look that hid a woman who had prepared an ambush. "Mr. Collins," I said, "I'm so grateful you could come." Henry often spoke of the steadiness of the law in calming storms. He smiled like a man who believes the law is a coat he wears to look respectable, but paperwork is as revealing as a bruise to a skilled woman. I offered him a chair and served him tea in the chipped mug. He commented on the mug as if it were an amusing relic. "Your husband had a fondness for that," he said. I had the recorder on the side table where the lamp made a pool of amber light. It wore the geometry of an old woman's patience. We spoke of small things until the conversation folded in on itself. "Mrs. Ellery," he said, "I did what I thought best. Our clients, Robert and Vivian, were anxious. They wanted to ensure someone could care for you." "For me?" I said lightly. "Or for the house?" He hesitated, and then, the thin varnish peeling from his manner, said, "There were concerns that the probate process could take months. It could tie up funds." He folded his fingers like a man arranging the leaves on a page. "I handled the durable power. It's standard. Handled?" I repeated. He leaned forward, perhaps wanting to appear confidential. "I drafted the document on April 2nd, Mrs. Ellery. We executed it on April 3rd. There was a small fee for expediency." "How small?" I asked. He named a figure, $5,000. He said it like one lists the cost of a clerk's stamp. I pretended I had not heard. Then I put the chipped mug to my lips and cleared them, and asked the question that would make the varnish crack and reveal the wood. "Did Robert suggest that you file any alternative documents, any that might supersede my Henry's will?" I asked. Mr. Collins' eyes moved like a man who waits to be paid for a secret. He gave me a half-answer, the sort that lived in the twilight between truth and convenience. "A client may make suggestions. My duty is to advise them. If anything was amiss, we can correct it." "Corrected?" I repeated, and the world narrowed to the little lamp and the angle of his jaw. "You know how easy it is to correct things after they've begun." He laughed then, too soft. "Mrs. Ellery, you're a generous woman. But these matters—" I took the recorder under the table with a hand that did not tremble. I had no right to entrap a man, perhaps, but what right had they to entrap my life? I slid the recorder closer in the hush, like a cat sliding its paw under a door. He spoke on, warming his voice with excuses and reasons. He admitted dates. He spoke of favors and arrangements. He said the word smooth 3 times. He called Robert stubborn but capable. Vivian he called decisive. He did not know, or perhaps he did, that my small machine was catching each breath. When he left, I poured the tea down the sink and waited a day to play it back. Because patience lends credibility even to electricity. I played the recording in the kitchen with the windows open to the garden where the laburnum shook its yellow teeth. The recorder's voice was grainy but not ambiguous. Mr. Collins' voice spoke the numbers, the dates, the arrangements. He had admitted, flatly and plainly, that he had agreed to expedite a durable power for the sum of $5,000 with the intention of facilitating transfers before probate. In the background, I could hear him say, "You understand, Mrs. Ellery, that probate is the kind of thing that sours families." It was the admission I needed: motive, collusion, and intent. The paper had been true. The man had made it living testimony. Then came the day I decided not merely to arm myself with documents, but to act. There is a peculiar gravity to a woman of my age when she decides to stand. Perhaps because the world expects us to fold, we are like a flag suddenly raised. The sight startles those who have grown used to the breeze. I called the probate judge of the Westshire Court, Judge Elijah Marlowe, whose portrait in the hallway of the court building always looks like a man who has had many meals and counted them kindly. I secured, through a neighbor who owed me a favor for knitting his boy a scarf, an appointment regarding an emergency injunction. I walked into the courthouse on April 14th at 10:05 a.m., the sun behind me making my hair a thin crown. The lobby smelled of dust and paper and the faint tang of roasted coffee. I had the recording and the email printouts in a folder that felt heavier than the pearls. The clerk at the desk looked at me with the practiced measurement of those who see frail bodies, but also know the metal that may hide within. Judge Marlowe listened to the filings with the patience of a man who knows that truth is often bartered for expediency. I handed him the recorder. The red light blinked and the machine spoke with the cadence of a confession. He asked my son Robert to come to chambers with a small, polite court summons for a hearing on April 20th, an emergency hearing to determine whether the durable power had been exercised appropriately. That night when I returned home, the house had the hush of a place that is waiting to find out what it is. I put the pearls on my neck and felt them like a collar of earned honor. I opened the locked jewelry box, and the will sat there like a small sun. I had placed it beneath the mason jar, not because it was clever, but because domesticity is often the most surprising of defenders. 2 days later, I was told by a clerk at the probate court, during a brief telephone call at 9:02 a.m., that someone had filed an interim will on April 12th, 2 days after my visit to the court clerk. The filing had been stamped at 2:01 p.m. The document claimed to supersede the April 1st will and bore the signatures of 3 witnesses, one of whom was Mrs. Gertrude Hale, a neighbor who had been buried 5 years earlier. The other 2 were unfamiliar. I remember the precise sound of the cup as it left my hand. It hit the sink and did not shatter. There are strange consolations in the sound of intact pottery. The clerk's voice on the phone said, "We'll investigate, Mrs. Ellery, but timing is everything. Timing is everything." That is the aphorism of thieves and the lament of the honest. Someone had moved faster than I had expected. But who? The dates, the emails, the recording, all pointed to a single nexus of malice and convenience: Mr. Collins and my son. I confronted Mr. Collins at his office on April 15th at 4:30 p.m., the light of a late spring afternoon creeping across legal pads. He greeted me with a semblance of regret, but I saw beneath it the small, shifty man pleased with his own cleverness. I placed the recording on his desk. "You have a choice," I said. "You can come clean to Judge Marlowe. You can tell him you were wrong." He smiled like a man who has rehearsed his excuses. "Mrs. Ellery, I have done my duty by my clients. Disputes in probate are common." I slid the email printouts toward him, letting them rest like a verdict. He blanched in a way that looked almost like sorrow, but there are cheap sorrows. His was the sort you can buy in bulk. "You will come with me to the hearing on April 20th and tell the truth," I said. He swallowed. "Mrs. Ellery, you are a charming woman, but you must understand how the law works." Before he had finished, my son Robert burst into the office like a man who has broken a window with his shoulder. His face was red with the theater of righteous anger. Vivian was behind him, a pillared presence of silk and scorn. "You've been talking to old friends," Robert said. "Have you been digging in drawers?" Vivian's eyes scanned the room with the arrogance of those who think themselves the sun around which lesser things orbit. "You're causing a scene, Mother," she said. I felt for a second like an unimportant object being rearranged on a stage. Then something in me, the gravity I had spoken of earlier, made me stand. "On April 1st, I said loudly enough for the office to feel the sound, "Henry wrote a will. It names me as the principal heir. I have it in my possession." Robert's face changed then, in a way that showed his hands were not as steady as his voice. He muttered something about medical decisions and assisted living, words that have the soft cruelty of antiseptic. Vivian smiled with a predator's grace. "Old women are sentimental," she said. "We know how to play the part of the betrayed mother." Her voice had the inflection of a woman who has read a script and believes she is the heroine. Mr. Collins, who had received the tape and the emails and who now faced possible disbarment and ruin, stood and said with the dignity of a man who had miscalculated his courage, "We must let the court decide." I walked out of that office with the recording and with a new certainty. The climax of my passive patience had arrived. There was no turning back. I would take the law, with its dry, slow gears, and make it serve a woman who had kept a mason jar. At home that evening, I put the will back in the box and wrapped the pearls twice in tissue. I wrote a short note to Judge Marlowe and enclosed a printed copy of the emails and the recording's transcript. I felt in that small administration like a general arranging his men on a board. I also felt alive, yet there is always a last desperate move by those who have been exposed. They will either open themselves to shame or strike while the world is blinking. On April 18th, 2 days before the hearing, when the house had its quiet and the laburnum's petals lay like small yellow coins on the gravel, someone removed the will from its box. I discovered it when I went to tuck the pearls in for the night. The box was slightly ajar. My heart found its way to the floor before my feet did. I looked beneath the mason jar, under the sideboard, in the pocket of the coat Henry had left on the peg. The will was gone. There was, cruelly, no sign of forced entry. The lock on the jewelry box was intact. The key I had hidden beneath the mason jar had not moved. They had not come with the crude violence of thieves. They had come with the discretion of someone who knows a house's habits. And there, on the kitchen table, in Vivian's handwriting, a single note. "We are only trying to protect what's best for you. Do not make this harder." The note lay like a small white leaf, deceptively simple. The house felt suddenly like an animal that had been muzzled. I held the note until the edges bent, until the ink made indistinct lines under my thumb. "You must understand this. Nothing is more humiliating than to be betrayed by children. It gnaws like rust on a beloved tool. The law might provide remedy, but it cannot mend the quiet ingestion of love. When those who have been fed on your bread turn to rearrange the furniture of your life, the pain is not just legal. It is the history of birthdays ignored and Sunday dinners replaced with takeout. Yet the recording remained, and the emails remained. There was also the knowledge, slender but true, that someone had attempted to erase my husband's clear hand and replace it with a lie. That knowledge was the coal that would ignite the rest of my strategy. I prepared myself for the hearing on April 20th. I made notes. I rehearsed, and I invited a small army of witnesses, Rosa, Daniel the bank clerk, and a neighbor who had seen Vivian at the study on April 2nd. I put the recorder and the email printouts in a sealed evidence envelope and took it to Judge Marlowe's chambers. The judge received them with the kind of gravity reserved for small catastrophes that could grow large if not addressed. The courtroom that day was a theater of restraint. People sat in rows like buttons. The air was the fine, taut feeling of a harp before the pluck. Mr. Collins arrived with a face that had been taught to look contrite. Robert and Vivian sat together, linked like people who share a secret and think it a bond. I watched them as if through plate glass. Then, in the middle of the hearing, a young man rose in the back. He was a law student named Avery Finch, who had been assisting Judge Marlowe with clerical work. He had a thin face and eyes like someone who has read many books, and not all of them ended well. He held up a printout. "I have just discovered an electronic filing," he announced. Time-stamped April 12th at 2:01 p.m., signed by a user ID that appears to belong to the probate court's online portal. The upload contains a scanned will. The air moved. "That filing," Judge Marlowe said, staring at his screen, "appears to have been uploaded from an IP address registered to 17 Greenwood Drive." My hands were steady for once, and I felt, absurdly, proud of their steadiness. "That is my home," I said. The room became a gear grinding into motion. Then, in the hush that followed, someone in the back of the gallery called out, "There's been an alarm at the house." It was a small sound, one man's voice, but it carried like a thrown stone. I heard footsteps rush, a whisper of fear like a curtain. The bailiff excused himself and left. Judge Marlowe peered at me, as if measuring whether I would stand or crumble. I stood. Then the clerk returned, breathless, and said, "Mrs. Ellery, your home alarm has been triggered. The police are on site. They report a disturbance. They are on their way." For a moment the courtroom turned into a coin tossed in the air, weightless and spinning. I felt my life, a long, slow string of domestic acts and small mercies, hang for a second on the edge of a coin. The bailiff's voice was small and urgent. "Mrs. Ellery, if you have any reason to believe evidence may be tampered with, we should consider a stay." My son and his wife sat like queens of a sudden. Small triumph. Mr. Collins looked as if the ground beneath him was now a stage trap door. I thought of Henry's handwriting, of the way he had written April 1st with a flourish, and then of the note in Vivian's handwriting that lay on my table like a sliver of ice. The crisis was upon us. I had the recording, I had the emails, and I had the knowledge of who had motive and access. But someone had moved the will before the court could examine it. I will not pretend I was not afraid. Fear is an honest thing that visits the courageous as often as it visits the timid. What I will say is this: the moment of greatest peril is also the moment of choice. One either lights the lantern or one waits in the dark. Dumas wrote that destiny is a ledger and men its accountants. I had found an accountant who had falsified the sums, and now the ink was drying. I must act, not like a woman wrapped in memory, but like a woman who had learned to keep both memory and retribution in her apron pocket. The police would arrive. The court would consider the filing, and the house would be a scene in which every servant had a story to tell. My son would speak of duty. My daughter might say she was too busy to care. Vivian would smile, practiced and cruel. I left the courtroom with Judge Marlowe's permission to go to the house with 2 officers to secure the premises. The drive from the courthouse to 17 Greenwood was a braid of streets and houses I had known for decades. The luster of morning had gone. The sky held the low, sullen blue of a day that has been waiting. When we arrived, the police officer took my hand, gentle, practical, young. The front door stood ajar. Inside, the house smelled of lemon oil and something metallic. I followed the officers room by room. The living room was untouched, the study door closed. In the kitchen, the mason jar looked like a small, knowing eye. There were footprints in the dust on the hearth. The jewelry box lay open and empty. The curtains quivered in a draft from the back door. We moved to the study. The blotter was overturned. The safe that Henry had kept under the floor had been opened. They had taken the will. And yet, on the blotter, in a pile of papers that should not have been left in a hurry, lay a small sealed envelope with my name on it. The seal was fresh and smelled faintly of the citrus perfume Vivian favored. I took the envelope with hands that remembered lullabies. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I unfolded it. It was a photograph of Henry, alive and laughing in his shirt sleeves, with my pearls at his throat, and on the back, in a hand I knew well, but did not expect, were 2 words, forged, listen. I dropped the photograph as if it had burned me. The courthouse fell away, and the house shrank to the size of a matchbox. The officers looked at me with the practical concern of those who have served many small tragedies. I could feel the world narrowing to the point of a needle. I had proof that someone believed a forgery had been made. I had a recording. I had emails. I had the knowledge that the will had been taken. I also had now a photograph with a note that spoke to me in Henry's hand. Somewhere, in the rooms beyond, someone was moving. I felt, as the police radio crackled, that a curtain had been pulled. The court date loomed still. The clock was wound and losing its patience, and in the very next instant, as if the drama were a play with its final act about to be struck, my name was called over the police radio. Officer Finch, please report to the back garden. There's a disturbance. I followed, my shoes whispering on the gravel, and there, under the laburnum that had shed its yellow coins like forgiveness, stood my son Robert, but not as I had seen him before. He stood with his back to the garden fence and a figure I did not expect between him and the world. It was Vivian, and she held something in her hand that caught the sun like a blade. I will not tell you everything that happened next, because some moments deserve the hush of a held breath, but I will tell you this. The world pivoted, not on a court's gavel or on legalese, but on a single human decision. I stepped forward, the pearls warm at my throat, and I said the one sentence that, in that turning, had the force of a verdict. Do not touch my husband's paper. Their faces turned to me with an expression that was part fury and part surprise. The same look a young thief gives when the shopkeeper, unseen, catches sight of him. Robert's jaw tightened, and Vivian's smile thinned. The police moved between us. The air was thin like a sheet of glass, and then, in a voice filtered through a woman who thought herself beyond the reach of consequences, Vivian said, "If you loved Henry, you would have trusted us." I looked at her, and for the first time I saw clearly the small hollows beneath her cheekbones, the way silk could not fill a want. I answered with a calmness that surprised even me. "If I loved Henry," I said, "I would have read his hand." The officers led them away for questioning. Compelled by the photograph and the web of emails and the recording, they did not yet arrest them, but procedures turn like slow mills. The house settled into a brittle quiet. I sat on the back step and held the photograph until the edges blurred. The day had been long, and the court had not yet decided. But I had done something I had thought beyond me. I had stepped into the light and demanded that the law see what had become of my life. Dumas taught that patience is a sword wrapped in velvet. I had found that the blade is sharp enough, yet every victory in this era felt provisional, as if soap bubbles confected in the air could pop at the slightest breath. I had the recording. I had the emails. I had the photograph. I had said in public that there had been a forgery. And I had one more thing, a feeling in my breast that this was not the end, but the moment just before a turning so great that everything would be different. Now, I must tell you, the law is a slow and stately creature. It does not leap. It walks with the care of a creature that has seen many winters. But that does not mean it cannot be made to run. When I walked back into the house that night, the lamp burning like a patient eye, I felt that the next steps would demand a fierceness I had only worn like a shawl. The photograph lay on my palm like a small, warm confession. I had taken the first stage of my revenge, not for the delight of seeing them fall, but to retrieve what is mine in a world that has a tendency to unmake the commitments of good men. And yet, even as I wrote down the sequence of events for my counsel, and even as I rehearsed in my head how I would present the recording to the court, there was an ache at the base of my skull that told me the play had another act, one that would be crueler and more intimate than anything I had yet endured. Something moved in the corner of the kitchen. A shadow. A small scrape like a shoe against tile. I turned, and the house seemed to inhale. The next step would be decided within hours. I never expected the next sound. I never expected the next sound. It was a small shove, almost a whisper, a scuff of shoe on gravel, and then the gasp of a woman surprised by her own peril. For an instant, everything was noise. The police radios, the laburnum's yellow coins stirring like startled birds, the shuffling of officers' boots. Then, as if a curtain had been pulled, the world narrowed to a single fact. The will was on the ground. Vivian's silk glove lay beside it, flung like a white flag. Her face when the glove fell is a memory I will keep. A carefully arranged ruin, lacquered with the effort of pretending that silk can make a conscience beautiful. Robert's shoulders slumped as if someone had removed the weight he had been pretending to carry. The officers did the things officers do. They separated, they questioned, they gathered things in plastic bags with the blue seriousness of people handling fragile evidence. I picked up the will with hands that did not shake. There are moments when you realize a small, astonishing truth. Old hands can be steadier than a young heart. The paper felt like a page from a ledger Henry might have balanced, solid, steady, having nothing to disguise. The signature at the bottom, Henry's looping H, was faint, but there. I breathed into the paper like a child offering a prayer. Yet even with the will in my hand, the path was not clear. I had evidence, a recording, emails, witnesses, and now a recovered document. But the law moves with the slowness of tides and the deliberate patience of oak. Justice is not a blade one can wave for effect. It is a loom, and one must feed threads into it with care. They took Vivian and Robert to the station for questioning. Mr. Collins, whose face had been drained of its old oily polish, was placed in the uncomfortable light of a man who has miscounted his receipts. The police, bless their practical hearts, wanted facts. The prosecutor, Ms. Elaine Harding, wanted file boxes. Judge Marlowe wanted nothing more than truth and the minimum of fuss. He is a man who keeps his beard trimmed and his conscience tidier. I sat in a chair at the police station that smelled of lemon disinfectant and old vinyl, and felt like a spectator in a far too intimate play. Rosa was there, cheeks flushed, telling what she had seen. Daniel from the bank, my sturdy clerk friend, brought the copies of the scanned durable power document and the bank's internal log showing the PDF uploaded on April 3rd at 11:45 a.m. Avery Finch, that thin-eyed law student with the bookworm figure, produced the IP log that had first hinted to the court something cramped and dishonest had been hiding in plain sight. An April 12th upload at 2:01 p.m. from an IP address that mapped to 17 Greenwood Drive. I love lists because they comfort me. They make a messy world read like an inventory. Here was mine, then and there, the recorder with Mr. Collins' voice admitting fees and expedients. The email chain printed across several pages with the phrase, "Fee for expedited handling, $5,000, discretion assured." The bank transaction showing a $5,000 debit on April 2nd from an account tied to Robert. CCTV stills of Vivian at the study desk on April 2nd at 1:24 p.m. the recovered will in my hand, the smear of perfume on the envelope, the note on the back of the photograph Henry had left. Forged. Listen. I read the words like one reads a final instruction from a late father. Do you wonder how small things loom? A perfume smudge can be a fingerprint in a family's ruin. A stamp, a shoelace, a clerk's log. These are the atoms from which culpability is made. I thought, with the peculiar calm of those who have lived long enough to see patterns repeat, that the law would move now like a careful clock. The prosecutor was brisk and kind. Mrs. Ellery, she said, we will convene a grand jury for the charges of forgery and conspiracy if the evidence supports it. In the meantime, we will petition for a temporary restraining order, TRO, and a temporary freeze on disbursements over $5,000 until the matter is adjudicated. A TRO is a paper that acts like a hand on a runaway cart. It stops things. A legal voice saying, pause. It was filed on April 21st at 3:14 p.m. and stamped by the clerk with a tiny circular indignation. The bank, bound by its policies and the weight of its reputation, complied and froze transfers pending review. I felt a small, pragmatic joy, the kind that blooms in the chest of someone who has been waiting with a wood stove to be lit. I will tell you now of the forensic work, because it is the slow, miraculous thing that makes fraud look under a microscope and say, you cannot hide. A forensic document examiner, Dr. Lillian Moreau, who smelled faintly of coffee, and had the patience of someone who has read the Bible in original languages, compared Henry's known signatures with that interim will filed April 12th. She looked at pen pressure, ink composition, the rhythm of strokes, the way an honest writer lifts his pen. She told us, in a voice threaded with pity and professional disgust, that the signature on the April 12th document was inconsistent with Henry's hand and with the ink's known aging pattern. It was, she said plainly, a forgery. We lodged her affidavit with the court on April 23rd at 10:20 a.m., and with it a digital forensic report that traced the PDF upload and the email headers. The headers were a tapestry. Someone had tried to weave a plausible tale, but they had left a thread bare. The metadata was stubbornly truthful. The files had originated from a workstation registered to the Ellery household. The timestamps were intact. The CCTV showed Vivian at the desk that day. Rosa corroborated that she had seen Vivian with a manila envelope, Mr. Collins's bank account. When subpoenaed, showed a $5,000 credit on April 2nd, described as consultancy fee. Greed, as I said before, is clever, but cleverness often leaves a small seam. We had found it, tugged, and the seam had given. The envelope is younger than it looks. A hearing was scheduled for April 26th at 9:30 a.m. in the probate court, a day that would be long in my memory. The courtroom smelled of lemon oil and old paper, as always, and the rows filled with acquaintances whose faces turned at my entrance like attendees at a humble hero's coming of age. The gallery murmured. Some people had opinions and wore them like fans. Robert and Vivian sat close, their whispers like the rustle of a newspaper in a draft. Mr. Collins sat with his chin drawn into his collar like a man who had been taught to hide. Judge Marlowe, with his beard the color of old wheat, called the session to order at 9:36 a.m. The prosecutor made her case with the tidy precision of a woman removing weeds from a garden. She laid out the emails, the bank transaction, the recording, the CCTV stills, Dr. Moreau's affidavit, and the recovered will as if each piece were a stepping stone across a river. If the court finds the April 12th filing to be a forgery, and that actions were taken in furtherance of that filing, namely, the attempted transfer of funds and conveyance of property, this would constitute actionable fraud and subject the responsible parties to both civil and criminal penalties, she said. Then she played the recording. I will never forget the sound of Mr. Collins' voice in that room, a small, ordinary man confessing the extraordinary in a soft, mortal tone. We can smooth the transfers ahead of probate, for a fee. There are phrases that hang like a noose. That was one of them. When it came my turn to speak, I did not declaim like a courtroom actor. I spoke simply, the way one speaks at a graveside or at the bedside of a child with a fever. I said, Henry loved order. He wrote things because he believed the world could be fair if one put pencil to paper and dated it honestly. I will not let men with smooth hands and glossy words unmake what he intended. Judge Marlowe looked at me long, and something in his face, mercy or lawful temper, softened. Given the weight of evidence, he said, I find there is probable cause to believe the April 12th filing is not a valid testament. The court orders a temporary injunction preventing transfer of real property and freezes accounts above $2,000. Further, we refer this matter to the district attorney for possible criminal prosecution. The applause in my chest was private. The court's gavel tapped, not for triumph, but to mark the next stage, a referral. This was not yet full justice. Courts lay down paths, and judgment often walks slowly upon them. There is in me a Dumas-esque belief that the scales of providence are not blind, but merely patient. Before the final act, allow me this aside. Men conceive cunning as their shield, but destiny is the ledger in which every cleverness is tallied and returned. Pride makes shrines of small victories. Truth will overturn them, as wind overturns a careless cart. Pride cracks where truth is heavy. What followed was less theatrical and more administrative, yet it had the quiet cruelty of a day when bridges are closed and travelers must take the long route. There were depositions, cold rooms where people repeat their stories into plastic recorders. There were forensic reports gathering signatures like snow. There were interviews and subpoenas and the small, terrible tedium of law. The prosecutor worked as a woman who has decided to be meticulous. In her hands, the evidence became a compelling argument. Mr. Collins, when confronted with his ledger and his bank statement, broke in ways that were not dramatic but inevitable. He answered the prosecution's questions with the weary honesty of a man who has sold his better self for small sums. He admitted to drafting documents for the Ellery household and to receiving $5,000, which he had described once as a consultancy fee. He tried to say that he had only expedited documents at the request of clients who were anxious, but the recording, like a stubborn witness, held him fast. Robert testified in his own defense, and his voice was the voice of someone who had been raised to think that the world gives you what you're owed only if you take it. I thought I was protecting Mother, he said, suddenly small. I feared probate would leave us unable to maintain the house. There was, in that sentence, a wounded child pleading with a woman who could not be surprised. I felt, in spite of everything, a mother's old instinct. But a mother's instincts do not absolve a son of his theft. Vivian, when asked why she had gone to the study on April 2nd, said she had been arranging estate paperwork because she cared for the family's welfare. Her voice was practiced pity. But when the detective showed her the CCTV still of her at the desk, when Dr. Moreau explained ink aging, and when the bank produced the IP logs and the $5,000 transfer, the fabric of her excuses unraveled like a dress snagged on a nail. People who depend on silk for armor are brittle at the seams. There came a day, quiet and clear, when the district attorney formally indicted Mr. Collins on charges of forgery and conspiracy and filed charges against Robert and Vivian for conspiracy to commit fraud. The legal documents were precise. Count I, forgery of testamentary document, April 12, 2025. Count 2, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, March 28, April 12, 2025. Count 3, attempted embezzlement of estate assets, $230,000. The indictment was cold as a winter morning. It was served on May 2nd at 11:10 a.m. I remember the time because the clock in the DA's office always makes time feel like it's being counted in prayer beads. The social consequences were immediate and stinging in a way courts do not touch. The gala the family had planned for the end of April, Henry's memorial and the annual charity, was postponed indefinitely. Invitations that had been printed with gold script were set aside like abandoned reputations. Vivian's social circle, which had once considered her a rising star of cultural salons, began to look at her with the peculiar sour mix of pity and avoidance that does to a woman what frost does to a late-blooming rose. Robert's colleagues called him and said little and then nothing. Justice, as Dumas would note, is not only punitive. It is theatrical. Those who have tried to erase a person sometimes find themselves erased by society's quiet disapproval. But the law gave me more than disapproval. It gave me restitution. On June 10th, at a hearing that lasted until the light in the court's tall windows slanted gold, the probate court admitted Henry's April 1st will to probate and declared the April 12th filing void ab initio, void from the beginning. The judge appointed a neutral executor, Ms. Caroline Reed, a woman of sober face and efficient hands, to administer Henry's estate pending final resolution. The accounts were unfrozen once the court ordered that funds necessary for household operation be disbursed under oversight, $5,000 per month to manage living expenses, for which I wrote a list of acceptable expenditures as if I were drawing a map for survival. The pearls came back to me with a small private ceremony. Caroline Reed delivered them in a plain box at my kitchen table and said, "Mr. Ellery wished these to be with you." I put them on as if fastening my dignity around my neck. They felt like small, cool planets against my skin, reminders that some things hold their place when the world tilts. Mr. Collins surrendered his license. The Bar Association held a hearing where his misdeeds were laid like a buffet, too many small potatoes, each one revealing a lack of moral seasoning. He was disbarred in July. The court ordered restitution of $5,000 to the estate and a fine the size of which made him stoop. For a man who had measured his life in briefs and billable hours, it was a modest ruin. The criminal case proceeded against Robert and Vivian. They pleaded guilty to conspiracy in a plea that bore the hollow ring of regret. Their sentence included probation, restitution, and community service. The court, merciful perhaps because family scandals damage many, did not send them to prison, but the stain on their names is a punishment of a different order. Reputation is a fragile thing. The house returned to me not as a dominion reclaimed, but as a domestic kingdom I had to learn to inhabit again. People asked me, in the pitying tone of those who expect age to be broken by sorrow, whether I intended to sell the property. I said no. Henry and I had built our life slow, like good bread. The house was the oven and the recipe both. I did not seek to punish with cruelty. That is a lesser victory than it is an indulgence. My aim was the restoration of what Henry had declared and the dignity of being treated as a full person. I arranged for Vivian's silk garments, those symbols of a carefully curated life, to be folded and given to charity. Robert came by once, awkward and shrunken, with a small, crooked apology. I listened. I felt the old twitch of maternal surrender, and then the clearer knowledge that love does not preclude consequences. The mason jar, the chipped mug, the pearls, these domestic things regained their solidity as if no tempest had shaken them. Rosa was given a permanent position and a raise that I funded in part from Henry's bequest for household maintenance. I paid for Dr. Moreau's services as a matter of courtesy and gratitude. I donated a small portion, $20,000, to the charity Henry and I had supported for years. Money unburdened by guilt can be a kind of grace. There were nights when I sat by the window and the laburnum shed its yellow coins like confessions. Sometimes I would take out the photograph Henry had left, the one with forged "Listen" scribbled on the back, and breathe. I would think of the strange alchemy of fate, how a small, astute observation, Rosa's memory, a clerk's log, a law student's curiosity, had together made a net in which my family's intent had been caught. The greatest justice, perhaps, is not what the court gives, but what a person gives herself, the right to stand up and say, "No more." I had that right. I exercised it with whatever decorum an old woman might summon, and in return the world, slow to be civil, became kinder in small ways, like soap left on a shelf. And yet, after all the papers were signed and the court's final orders issued on July 18th, when Henry's wishes were finally being carried out and the house felt whole again, I discovered something more valuable than any restored bank balance. It was a letter Henry had written before he died, a small thing he had tucked into his raincoat pocket and left forgotten until the estate's inventory turned up a cache of personal notes. He had written in a hand that trembled, then steadied. "If ever they try to take what we built, remember that honesty outlives trickery. Give them a chance to make amends, Elena, but do not let them keep your dignity." I read the letter in the kitchen, the evening sun turning the room into a cup of warm tea. I felt Henry's hand on my shoulder as if he were still beside me. I smiled, thinking of the way his voice used to insist that tea was the solution to some problems. Then I set the letter beside the mason jar as if it were a talisman. Justice had its procedural parts, freezes and hearings, affidavits and forensic charts, but the moral end of this tale is quieter. Truth, when held patiently and with craft, has the stubbornness of roots. I was not vindictive. I was simply persistent. I had chosen to be a witness to my own life. Some debts are paid in silence. What would I tell you, now that the rooms are quiet and the pearls are warm at my throat? I would tell you that betrayal cuts deep because it comes from the inside. That a child who sees a parent as an obstacle rather than a treasure will one day stand alone with the knowledge that houses built on theft cannot keep out the cold. I would tell you that dignity is not a garment to be given and taken at will. It is a steady way of being. The moral is simple and Dumas-like in its keen ambition. Men may be architects of plots, but the architecture of virtue cannot be raised by scaffolds of deceit. In the long account of a life, every false entry is eventually countermanded by truth. Those who live by cunning shall be accounted for in due course. Truth will find the ledger. Now, because this is the world we live in with its bright screens and its quick sympathies, and because I find a quiet pleasure in that old, small ritual of speaking to someone across the air, I will leave you with one practical thing and one soft urging. If my story has touched you, if you have ever felt small in a house that feels too large, if someone you love has been treated in a way that makes your bones ache, do something concrete. Keep your documents in more than one place. Tell someone you trust where they are, and if you can, record the small oddities that feel wrong. The world has many sly people, but the world also has small, stubborn allies like Rosa and Daniel and Avery. Keep them close. If this tale has warmed you or burned you with righteous fire, share it with someone who needs courage today. Tell it to a neighbor. Tell it to a friend. Subscribe for more stories from an old heart that is not yet done telling the truth. Comment below if you have been betrayed and found your way back. I read every word. And the answers you write will hold someone up. I put the pearls away at night now, and sometimes I take them out and count them like rosary beads, tracing time with those small moons. The mason jar sits on its shelf, full of coins and small receipts, and I think of it as a ledger of careful survival. There are still days when I walk to Henry's chair and place a cup on the table in a ceremony of habit. There are still evenings when the radio plays and I hum along with the news. Life goes on, stitched into place by ordinary acts. If you have listened this far, thank you. May your own life be guarded by truth and warmed by tea. May you keep the key to your box beneath the jar of ordinary things, and should someone ever reach for it with intent to steal, may you have the courage and the patience to take it back.